Hello. Thanks for spending so many hours with me. As we come to the end of these lectures on sacred texts of the world, it might be useful to spend some time answering two questions. First, where do we go from here? And second, what difference might the comparative study of Scripture make in our lives? One of the pleasures of putting together this course has been taking the opportunity myself to reread so many sacred texts. As I was writing lectures, I reread the entire Bible, including the Apocrypha, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Lotus Sutra, and much more. For good measure, I even read a couple of the Gospels in Greek and the Tao Te Ching in classical Chinese. As I did so, I was constantly reminded what an odd thing it is to learn about written texts in an oral presentation like this one. I will feel like a failure as your professor if after listening to all these lectures, you don't actually read some of the scriptures that we've been talking about. So I'm going to make some specific recommendations, which will also give us a chance for a quick review of where we've come in these 36 lectures. For each of the major religious traditions, I'll give 2 or 3 texts, maybe 30 to 100 pages each, that would be a good place to start if you're coming to them for the first time. There are many translations available, but for a quick rule of thumb, the Penguin Classics and the Oxford World's Classics series consistently offer fine translations of many of the world's most significant sacred texts. We'll start with Hinduism. If you're interested in Hinduism and you read only one thing from this religion, it ought to be the Bhagavad Gita. Although it's Smriti, remember that's what's remembered rather than Shruti, what's heard. It's nevertheless the most well-known and beloved scripture in Hinduism, and it's not too long. If you've already read the Gita and are feeling a little more adventurous, you might try a couple of the Upanishads, which are part of the Vedas and thus do count as Shruti. Remember that Smriti are authoritative writings that are attributed to human beings, while Shruti are considered to be divine in their origins, revelations of sacred syllables reverberating through the cosmos as perceived and transmitted orally by ancient sages. The Isha and Katha Upanishads are easy to read, and they provide a good introduction to that literature. For Judaism, it would be nice to try something from each of the 3 sections of the Tanakh. From the Torah, you might sample Genesis, which includes some of the most famous stories in the Hebrew Bible, stories of Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, and Abraham sacrificing Isaac, along with themes of covenant and strong female characters, and a marvelous story, it's almost a novella, of Joseph in Egypt. From the Prophets section, I would recommend 2nd Isaiah, that is Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, which most scholars date to the 6th century BCE during the Babylonian exile. There, in magnificent poetry, you can read about the one God, his relationship with Israel, and his love for all humankind with promises of deliverance and restoration and renewal. And from the writings, you can't go wrong with the brief book of Ruth, a simple yet moving tale of ordinary people and extraordinary kindness. By the way, if you've come from a Christian background, you should definitely take a look at the Jewish Publication Society translation of the Tanakh to see how Jews read their own sacred texts. As you'll recall, the entire Tanakh is regarded as holy, but the Torah, the first 5 books, is especially sacred and is read aloud in synagogues over the course of a year. Conservative Jews believe that the Torah was revealed by God to Moses, and some go so far as to assert that it predated the world and was used as a blueprint for creation. Other Jews accept the results of the historical critical method and view the Torah and the prophets and the writings as the product of many sources edited and revised and put together over centuries. Jewish tradition claims that Moses received not only the written Torah at Mount Sinai, but also the oral Torah, which was eventually written down in the 3rd century of the Common Era as the Mishnah, and then later expanded into the 2 Talmuds. If you're interested in exploring that literature, a good place to start is with the Tractate Avot, it means the Fathers, in the 4th division of the Mishnah. The Avot is a brief collection of wise sayings and moral maxims from famous rabbis. It's an easy document to sort of dip in and to read around a little bit and get the feel of what's going on, and sometimes be inspired by what you might find there. Moving on to Buddhism, one of the most beloved texts from the Theravada tradition is the Dhammapada, which sets forth the basic principles of Buddhist doctrine and morality in 423 verses. It's engaging, it's easy to read. The canon of Mahayana Buddhism is huge, but there's one book that's considered by many to be the fullest expression of the Buddhist teachings, and that's the Lotus Sutra. Okay, that book is a bit on the long side, maybe 300 pages. But if you were to read the first 4 chapters, it's like 80 pages or so, you'll have a good idea of what it was all about. And those chapters include the famous parables of the burning house and the prodigal son. Not the prodigal son from the Gospels, it's sort of this Buddhist version of a story that's similar in some ways. The Buddhist sutras were considered the words of the Buddha, recalled and transmitted by his disciple Ananda, who had heard them firsthand and then memorized them and then passed them on. Though the miraculous nature and transmission is much more pronounced in the Mahayana Sutras, where there were bodhisattvas and celestial beings that were listening into these sermons of the Buddha. For those of you who might like to try something from Zen Buddhism, which is a branch of Mahayana, you could read the Mumonkan, the Gateless Gate, it's called, which is not the word of the Buddha, but rather a 13th century collection of 48 koans in the form of brief anecdotes about Zen masters and their students. For East Asian religion and philosophy, and the boundaries between those two disciplines are not very sharp in China and Japan, there are 2 texts that you should definitely start with, the Analects of Confucius and the Tao Te Ching. The Analects are brief, fairly straightforward sayings of Confucius. The Tao Te Ching, as you'll recall, was originally an anonymous collection of wisdom sayings that was later attributed to Lao-Tzu, the legendary Lao-Tzu, and then eventually elevated to the status of a divine text. You'll probably need to read this provocative but cryptic book more than once, and that's okay, because the Tao Te Ching reads pretty quickly. 2 more major traditions to go. For Christianity, you should read one of the Gospels. Mark is the earliest and the shortest. Matthew has the most connections to Judaism and includes the Sermon on the Mount, while the Gospel of John is often considered the most spiritual. But I might recommend Luke, perhaps the most literary of the 4, and then you could continue with the book of Acts, which was also written by Luke and offers a history of early Christianity. So, for Christianity, read one of the Gospels, maybe Acts, and then something from Paul. My Protestant friends would urge me to recommend the letter to the Romans, since it offers the fullest account of Paul's theology. But in a post-theological world, I might say, if you're new to Christianity, go with 1 Corinthians, which takes up a variety of issues that were of pressing practical importance to the first generations of believers. Perhaps I should explain, by post-theological world, I mean that today, even many Christians aren't that concerned about the nuanced differences of theology between different denominations and such. If you just sort of want a basic idea, go with 1 Corinthians. And if you're curious about Christian sacred texts that are outside the Bible, you might start with the Coptic Gospel of Thomas from the Nag Hammadi Library, which offers 114 short sayings attributed to Jesus. Many, as you remember, are similar to what we find in the 4 canonical Gospels, but there are others that are puzzling and a bit strange. But they might provide insight into what it could have been like to hear the Christian message for the first time. The Gospel of Thomas can also serve as an example of an abandoned or left behind scripture. The New Testament writings don't present themselves as direct revelation, but rather as reflective accounts of God's revelation in Jesus and the consequences of that divine intervention. Yet, in some mysterious fashion, these human compositions are thought to have been inspired to such an extent that they are without substantive error and they contain all necessary spiritual truths, at least from a conservative Protestant perspective. Muslims, by contrast, view their scripture, the Quran, as a miraculous transcript of a heavenly book, the original of which is in Arabic. It's God's primary revelation to humankind, given to Muhammad with the angel Gabriel as an intermediary. And most Muslims believe that the Quran is co-eternal with God, uncreated. So for Islam, the choice of which sacred text to read is obvious. But the Quran, with its 114 surahs, is a bit on the long side, some 400 to 500 pages in translation. For newcomers, I recommend starting with some of the shorter, earlier, more lyrical revelations toward the end of the volume, and then reading a few of the longer surahs that appear at the beginning. These were later revelations dating from the Medina period. Maybe Surah 2, the cow, 4, women, and Surah 5, the table. If you're coming from a Jewish or a Christian background, it might be interesting to read some of the middle surahs that are named after biblical characters. So Surah 10 is named Jonah, 12, Joseph, 19, Mary, maybe 71, Noah. And some Muslims feel that Surah 112 contains the essence of Islam. Indeed, Muhammad himself declared that this short surah was equal to a third of the Quran. In its entirety, 112 says, "Say, He is God the One, God the Eternal. He begot no one, nor was He begotten. No one is comparable to Him." Muhammad says just that surah is worth a third of the Quran. But speaking of the words of Muhammad, if you're interested in the hadith, or traditions about the Prophet, the best place to begin is with Al-Nawawi's 13th century collection of 40 hadith, which has long been the most popular introductory anthology of hadith. That's the one that children begin to read right after the Quran. Each of the hadith, there are actually 42, is about a paragraph long, so you can zip through the book pretty quickly. It's well worth the effort. And then a few suggestions for the newer, smaller religious traditions. The Adi Granth, also known as the Guru Granth Sahib, is the paramount scripture of Sikhism. As you'll recall, it's a collection of poetry by the Sikh gurus and some of their Hindu and Muslim predecessors, which was designated by the 10th Guru as the perpetual guru of the community. And it's been treated accordingly ever since as a living guru in book form. The Adi Granth is rather large, and although translations are available online, it's somewhat difficult to find selections that would make for a good introduction. I would recommend a 1995 anthology by Nikki Guninder Kaur Singh, which is unfortunately now out of print, though a reprint was done by Penguin India a few years ago. And the other recommendation is Nirmal Das's lovely translations of the writings of non-Sikh holy men that were incorporated into the Adi Granth. The best avenue into the scriptures of the Latter-day Saints is, of course, the Book of Mormon, which was thought to have been miraculously translated from ancient gold plates that were given to Joseph Smith by the angel Moroni. My Mormon friends might recommend that you jump right to the book of 3rd Nephi, which tells the story of the resurrected Jesus appearing to the people in the Americas. But I'm going to suggest that you start with 1st Nephi instead, which makes up the first 50 or so pages of the Book of Mormon. It's one of the more action-packed segments, and it will give you a good sense of the narrative and its characteristic themes, including revelation, deliverance, prophecy, and the importance of Scripture, as well as the allegory of the tree of life. I think you'll find it easier to follow the story, the narrative, if you read it in the Reader's Edition that was published by the University of Illinois Press. Though I would say that, since I was the editor for that particular volume. And finally, if you're curious about Baha'i, I recommend that you start with The Hidden Words, a collection of mystical sayings by Baha'u'llah, which he described as the essence of, and this is from the preamble, that which hath descended from the realm of glory, uttered by the tongue of power and might, and revealed unto the prophets of old. In addition to the hidden words, many have found the book Some Answered Questions to be a clear introduction to Baha'i teachings. This volume, which originated from a series of conversational talks given by Baha'u'llah's son Abdul Baha from 1904 to 1906, is also considered to be one of the sacred writings of the faith. My goodness, we've covered a tremendous number of sacred texts in this course, if those are only a few of the highlights. Yet we've also learned that there's more to Scripture than just words on a page. There's a great deal of variety in how these writings have been regarded and utilized in study and worship and ritual. Remember that in some traditions, worship requires the exact words, like readings of the Hebrew Torah in conservative synagogues or memorizing the Quran in Arabic, while other faiths emphasize making the contents as comprehensible as possible. So the meaning is what particularly matters. And in this way, Buddhists and Christians nearly always use their scriptures in translation. In Hinduism and Zoroastrianism, the sounds have sometimes been much more important than the meaning. And in many traditions, sacred books have been treated as holy artifacts. As an aside, the Sanskrit and Avestan scripts, so those are the language of the Vedas and the Zoroastrian scriptures, each have 53 letters, making them two of the largest alphabets in the world, in part because priests in both of those traditions needed to pronounce their sacred texts as precisely as they could. They want the script to mirror as closely as possible the sounds, the sacred syllables that they need to pronounce. So in addition to actually reading some of the scriptures from this course, I have another assignment for you. I want you to get on YouTube and look for examples of sacred texts in use, perhaps Vedic ceremonies, or Buddhist sutra chanting, or Quranic recitations, or the singing of the Adi Granth in a Sikh temple or Gurdwara. Watch some videos of religious weddings and see how sacred texts are employed there. Or even better, you could attend a worship service of a religion that's not your own, and maybe even find someone to talk to. You'll discover that most places of worship welcome visitors, and if you already know a little about their beliefs and scriptures, that is, if you show some genuine curiosity and respect, you're sure to find believers who are more than happy to converse with you. And now for the second big question. What difference might the comparative study of sacred texts make in our lives? Way back in the first lecture, I suggested that there were several good reasons to read other people's scriptures. They're usually accessible, they're easily accessible, they're usually central to the faith tradition, sacred texts can be compared with one another, and they can be sources of wisdom and beauty and awe. And finally, reading world scripture can help us better understand the lives of others and perhaps even provide greater insight into our own intellectual and spiritual commitments. As we close out this course, I want to talk a little more about that last reason, greater understanding. People argue about religion all the time, and scripture can sometimes be used as a weapon or a wedge, particularly since many sacred texts make very strong, mutually exclusive claims about God and reality and salvation. Yet reading scripture can also be a bridge between people with very different ideas about God and reality and salvation. When you hold a particular sacred text in your hands, it may or may not contain the truth about unseen forces or other realms of existence, but it most certainly contains truths about millions upon millions of believers who have accepted that text as authoritative, people who have structured their lives around its precepts or found meaning and satisfaction in its words and comfort. These are texts that people have made a part of themselves through study and memorization, which have shaped the mental worlds that they live in and that are often intrinsic to their identities. If you want to understand what's going on in the Middle East or in much of Africa, you need to read the Quran. Many of the basic values of China and Japan are not going to make sense until you've thought hard about the Confucian Analects and the Tao Te Ching. It's impossible to grasp American politics and culture without a basic knowledge of the Bible. When you turn on the news or you travel as a tourist, you often see the results of religiosity. You see religions in practice. But reading sacred texts will provide a more in-depth knowledge and take you into the heart of the tradition, where things get complicated. People submit to the authority of these texts, but they also struggle with them, and they're inspired by them. To live religiously, for many believers, is to be in a perpetual conversation with the texts that one holds sacred. Wilfred Cantwell Smith, speaking of Islam, has observed that the attempt to understand the Quran is to understand how it has fired the imagination and inspired the poetry and formulated the inhibitions and guided the ecstasies and teased the intellects and ordered the family relations and the legal chicaneries and nurtured the piety of hundreds of millions of people in widely diverse climes and over a series of radically divergent centuries. But of course, that's as true of Hinduism and Judaism and Buddhism and Christianity as it is of Islam. And that may lead to a conundrum. It's useful and often appropriate to take an academic, religiously neutral approach to world religions. We can study them and we can study their sacred texts carefully and empathetically while still remaining basically agnostic about their truth claims. But if we read world scripture as an expression of deeply human needs and aspirations, where does that leave those who might care personally about spiritual matters of transcendence or ultimate truth? As I was writing these lectures, I checked out hundreds of books from my university library, carrying big stacks of volumes back and forth from my office. Eventually, the librarians noticed this pattern, and one asked me, "Doesn't reading about all those religions diminish your own belief, your own faith?" That's what happened to me. That's not an unreasonable response. If you come from the background of a particular faith, it can be disconcerting or even threatening to realize that other people believe very different things with just as much sincerity as you do. Their ideas make as much sense to them. They have their own set of proofs and confirmations that aren't all that different from yours. And from a certain perspective, all religions seem rather implausible. With so many texts from so many faiths, who's to say, I'm right and all the rest of you are all wrong? Perhaps that's the case. I suppose we'll all find out in the end, one way or the other. But the situation doesn't have to be quite so polarizing. It's possible to remain true to one's own faith tradition while realizing that it falls short of perfection, and at the same time acknowledging the good in others, perhaps even admiring qualities that their religion has that are less pronounced in your own. The term holy envy has been used of such situations, and I have often felt it. The world's great religions have survived and flourished because they have, by and large, inspired their adherents to be better people, to care for others, and to work towards a higher vision of what life can be. There's no question that religion has also been a cause of conflict, of wars and oppression and even atrocities. But if violent, extreme strands of devotion are not tempered over time, they tend to burn themselves out. That's not what most people are looking for. Now notice that I'm talking about religious traditions. Remember that texts become scripture when they're accepted as authoritative by faith communities, which may present a second conundrum. Many people nowadays say that they are spiritual but not religious, perhaps because they're wary of the track record of religious institutions, often with good reason. You could regard the sacred texts of the world as all equally true, more or less, and pick out passages from here or there that make sense to you, that inspire you, in effect creating a unique, personalized faith. Actually, I worry that I may have encouraged such an approach by recommending so many scriptures that are collections of quotations, like the Avot, the Dhammapada, the Analects, and the Gospel of Thomas, and the Hidden Words. But as personally satisfying as a few random verses might be, it's still important to read scriptures within the context of their own traditions, as I've tried to do in this course. Taking sacred texts seriously means appreciating their role within communities that provide support and solace, but also make demands on believers. Let me conclude with two approaches to sacred texts that I think tend toward building bridges rather than erecting barriers or leveling differences. In the 1990s, Peter Ochs of the University of Virginia and David Ford at Cambridge University began the scriptural reasoning movement, which encourages small groups of believers from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, from the three Abrahamic religions, to get together and read passages from their sacred texts together. The point isn't to disparage or to convert, but rather to understand and learn from each other. The model for interactions is hospitality, to be a gracious host when inviting outsiders to comment upon one's own scriptures, and an attentive guest when listening to insiders share their sacred texts. David Ford, another founder of scriptural reasoning, has offered a series of guidelines, including the following. He says, "The aim is not consensus. That may happen, but it's more likely that the conclusion will be a recognition of deep differences. Do not be afraid of argument as one intellectually honest way of responding to differences. Part of mutual hospitality is learning to argue in courtesy and truth. Be open to mutual hospitality turning into friendship." Scriptural reasoning, although it originated in academia, offers a model of sacred reading as opposed to secular reading. Again, David Ford, acknowledge the sacredness of other scriptures to them without having to acknowledge its authority for oneself. Each believes in different ways, which can be discussed, that their scripture is in some sense from God, and that the group is interpreting it before God, in God's presence. There are both academic and non-academic groups practicing scriptural reasoning today, though the movement is probably more prominent in Britain than in the United States. You can see some examples of scriptural reasoning in action, some discussions, at www.scripturalreasoning.org. Scriptural reasoning brings together the adherents of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but an even broader vision of religious dialogue has been put forward by the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhists. In his book, Toward a True Kinship of Faiths, he explores similarities and differences between Buddhism and then Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, with constant attention to sacred texts. Perhaps not surprisingly, he identifies the ethics of compassion as a common ground for all. But I'm also impressed by his observation that an acceptance of religious pluralism does not necessarily undermine claims of exclusive truth. Even if all the major religions can't equally be true, they can nevertheless be equally legitimate, meaning that they're worthy of respect, since we can imagine why intelligent, moral people might choose to believe, even if we ourselves don't share that belief. The Dalai Lama writes, "The establishment of genuine interreligious harmony based on understanding is not dependent upon accepting that all religions are fundamentally the same, or that they lead to the same place. I have no doubt that a sincere believer can, with integrity, be a pluralist in relation to religions other than his own, without compromising commitment to the essence of the doctrinal teachings of his own faith." I certainly can't speak with the authority of the Dalai Lama, but I believe that reading other people's sacred texts with empathy and understanding can make the world a better place. There will always be differences between religions, and those differences matter a great deal. But as we come to better understand, and perhaps even admire those of different faith traditions, we can marvel at the religious diversity in the world and what those many traditions and scriptures might mean in the human experience.